Security. Remove her. The words didn't echo. They landed, heavy and final, like a door slamming shut in a room that had already gone cold. No one moved at first. Not the assistants lining the wall with tablets pressed to their chests. Not the attorneys seated in tailored silence. Not even the man by the window who had been seconds away from nodding the deal through. The only movement came from the faint hum of the overhead lights reflecting off the polished glass table, stretching long white streaks across a single sheet of paper clutched in Ava Carter's hand. She didn't step back, didn't argue, just stood there, shoulders squared, her maintenance badge catching the light like it didn't belong on her chest. Richard Whitmore didn't look at her again. He had already dismissed her in his mind, reduced her to a disruption, a delay, something to be cleared so the real business could continue. His fingers adjusted the cuff of his suit with practiced precision, the kind of movement that said control without needing to say a word. 2 security guards shifted near the door, waiting for the signal to become action. Ava felt the weight of every eye in the room without meeting a single one. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive cologne, sharp and sterile, like nothing real was allowed to exist here. 8 hours earlier, she had been wiping fingerprints off these same glass walls, invisible by design, moving quietly so conversations like this could happen uninterrupted. But something in that document, something buried between clean lines of legal language, had followed her, sat heavy in her chest, refused to be ignored. Her fingers tightened slightly around the page, the edge pressing into her palm, grounding her. One of the executives let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, the kind people make when they've already decided someone isn't worth listening to. You heard him, the man said under his breath, not even looking at her, as if speaking to the air was enough. Ava inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that doesn't show but steadies everything inside. She could feel the moment slipping, the exact second where she would either walk out and let it happen, or stay and carry the weight of whatever came next. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One signature, she said, calm and even, cutting clean. Through the silence, and you lose everything. That was when the room changed. Not visibly, not all at once, but something shifted, small, almost imperceptible, like the first crack in glass before it shatters. One of the guards paused mid-step. A pin stopped tapping. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked softly as someone leaned forward without meaning to. Richard's hand, the one resting near the contract, stilled for just a fraction of a second. He didn't turn fully, not yet, but his eyes moved, just enough to acknowledge the sound of a voice that didn't belong. Ava didn't move closer, didn't raise the paper. She simply held it there, steady, as if it weighed more than it looked. The light from the ceiling caught the edge again, flashing briefly across the surface before settling into stillness. In that moment, she wasn't a cleaner or a stranger or someone who had wandered into the wrong room. She was a line that had been crossed and now, quietly, drawn back. No one laughed this time. The air did not break. It tightened, like something invisible had pulled every breath in the room just a little too thin. Richard Whitmore slowly turned his head, not with surprise, but with irritation sharpened into focus, the kind reserved for interruptions that dared to sound certain. His eyes landed on Ava, steady, assessing, as if recalculating something he had already dismissed seconds ago. You are still here, he said, his voice low, controlled, each word measured like a line item on a balance sheet. It was not a question. Ava did not respond immediately. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the faint hum of the building's climate system and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere far down the corridor. One of the attorneys shifted in his chair, glancing toward the contract, then back at Richard, unsure whether to speak or stay invisible. Ava finally moved, but only enough to place the paper on the edge of the glass table, not sliding it across, not offering it forward, just setting it down like something that did not need permission to exist. Page 14, she said, her voice calm, steady, unshaken by the weight pressing against her from every direction. Second paragraph. Third line. A faint crease formed between Richard's brows. He did not reach for the document. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying her the way one studies an anomaly, something out of place that requires explanation before action. Do you understand what room you are standing in? He asked. Ava met his gaze, not challenging, not lowering hers either, simply present. "Yes, sir," she said. "That is why I spoke." A quiet murmur rippled through the table, subtle, restrained, quickly swallowed. Someone cleared their throat. Another executive leaned forward just enough to glance at the contract, fingers hovering near the page but not touching it. The hesitation was contagious. Richard's attention shifted, just briefly, toward the document. The pen near his hand rolled a fraction of an inch as his fingers brushed against it, the small movement louder than it should have been in the silence. He looked back at Ava. "And you believe you have found something my legal team did not?" His tone was not mocking. It was worse. It was dismissive with precision. Ava did not flinch. "I believe it was meant to be missed," she said. That landed differently. Not louder, not sharper, but deeper. The kind of sentence that does not ask for attention but takes it anyway. One of the lawyers reached for the contract now. Flipping to the page she mentioned, the sound of paper cutting softly through the stillness. I scanned. Paused. Scanned again. A second lawyer leaned in, closer this time, reading over the same lines, his expression shifting in small, controlled increments. Richard noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. His hand moved toward the document at last, slow, deliberate, as if speed would admit doubt. He pulled it closer, the glass surface reflecting the text back up at him in faint reverse, words layered over themselves like something trying to hide in plain sight. His gaze moved across the paragraph, then stopped, just for a second. But it was enough. The room felt it. No one spoke. No one needed to. Ava remained where she was, hands relaxed at her sides now, no longer gripping the paper because she did not need to hold it anymore. The truth was already on the table. Richard read the line again, slower this time, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as the meaning settled in. Somewhere behind him, a chair shifted again, softer this time, as if even movement had learned to be careful. He did not look up right away. But when he did, the room was no longer the same. The silence did not just linger, it deepened, like the room itself had decided to listen more carefully. Richard Whitmore did not speak. He did not need to. The contract remained open in front of him, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the page, as if even touch required precision now. His eyes moved across the clause again, slower this time, tracing each word not as assumption, but as verification. Across the table, the senior attorney adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, his lips parting slightly before closing again, the realization forming but not yet spoken. Ava watched none of them. Her gaze stayed neutral, not fixed on any one person, but aware of everything. The faint reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the glass, bending around the printed text, making the words appear doubled, layered, harder to ignore. One of the younger executives cleared his throat softly, almost involuntarily. "That language," he began, then stopped, glancing toward the attorney beside him. The attorney did not answer immediately. He ran his finger under the line Ava had pointed out, then flipped back one page, then forward again, cross-referencing silently, his expression tightening with each second. Richard's jaw shifted slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. The kind that arrives quietly and settles heavily. "Explain it," he said at last, his voice still calm, but stripped of its earlier dismissal. It was no longer directed at Ava. It was directed at the room. The senior attorney inhaled, straightened, and spoke carefully. "The liability transfer is embedded within a conditional clause tied to post-merger compliance," he said, choosing each word with caution. "If executed as written, it would place full financial and legal responsibility on our side, regardless of origin." A pause followed. Not long, but long enough for the meaning to land. Someone shifted in their seat. Another leaned back slowly, eyes narrowing as the implications expanded beyond the page. Richard's hand moved away from the contract, resting flat against the table now, the surface cool beneath his palm. He looked up, not at Ava immediately, but at the executives who had been ready to proceed minutes ago. No one met his eyes directly. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had thinned into something quieter, more uncertain. Then, finally, he looked at her. Ava did not change her posture. She stood, exactly as she had, steady, composed, as if the weight of the moment did not belong to her, but to those just beginning to understand it. "How did you see it?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried something new. Not authority. Not challenge. Something closer to curiosity, though it had not yet softened fully into that. Ava took a small breath, not for courage, but for clarity. Because it does not read like protection, she said. It reads like permission. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. The senior attorney glanced back at the document, then at Richard, then back again, as if hoping the text might change under a second look. It did not. Another executive reached for a tablet, pulling up the digital version, fingers moving quickly now, urgency replacing earlier indifference. The room was no longer still. It was shifting, recalibrating, each person adjusting to a reality that had not existed minutes ago. Richard remained seated, but something in his presence had changed. The control was still there, but it was no longer absolute. It had been interrupted, redirected, challenged not by force, but by something far more difficult to dismiss. Truth, placed quietly on a table, refusing to move. No one rushed to speak after that. The movement in the room slowed again, but it was no longer the stillness of dismissal, it was the stillness of recalculation. Screens lit up one by one as tablets and laptops refreshed the same document, the same clause, the same line that had gone unnoticed until a voice that was not supposed to matter forced it into view. The faint tapping of keys replaced the earlier silence, soft but urgent, like something fragile being handled too late. Richard Whitmore remained where he was, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders no longer angled toward the deal, but toward the disruption that had stopped it. His gaze moved again to the page, then back to Ava, not with skepticism this time, but with something closer to focus. Who drafted this section? He asked, his voice steady, directed at no one in particular yet expected to be answered. The senior attorney hesitated, flipping through supporting documents, scanning signatures, initials, timestamps. It appears to originate from the opposing firm's compliance team, he said carefully, though his tone lacked the certainty it would have carried. Earlier, another attorney leaned in, pointing to a subsection buried beneath layers of cross-references. It is structured to appear standard, he added, but the trigger conditions are unusually broad. The words settled heavily, each one adding weight to what Ava had already placed on the table. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose, not frustrated, not yet, but aware. The kind of awareness that comes when control reveals its blind spots. He reached for the pen again, not to sign, but to move it away, setting it down with quiet finality several inches from the contract, the distance small but decisive. Across the table, an executive who had been confident minutes ago now leaned back, arms crossing unconsciously, his eyes fixed on the clause as if it might shift again if he stared long enough. It did not. Ava remained still, but her presence no longer blended into the edges of the room. She did not need to move forward to be seen. The room had already adjusted around her. A faint reflection of her figure appeared in the glass wall behind Richard, framed by the skyline beyond, a contrast of quiet against structure, of something overlooked against something built to dominate. Why did you not bring this to someone earlier? One of the executives asked suddenly, his tone not accusatory, but searching, as if trying to understand the timing, the interruption, the risk she had taken by speaking at all. Ava turned her head slightly, acknowledging the voice without shifting her stance. Because no one was looking, she said simply. The answer did not rise, did not fall, it just existed, and in that simplicity it carried more weight than any explanation could. A brief silence followed, not empty, but filled with the recognition of something uncomfortable. Richard's eyes remained on her, studying, measuring again, but differently now. Not to dismiss, to understand. He stood then, slowly, the movement controlled but deliberate, the chair behind him sliding back with a soft sound that echoed more than it should have. The entire room adjusted with him, attention pulling toward the center without being asked. He stepped around the table, stopping just short of where the paper rested, looking down at it for a moment before lifting his gaze back to Ava. Up close, the difference in presence was clear, his tailored precision against her stillness, his authority against her calm. But the space between them no longer felt one-sided. You interrupted a multi-million-dollar decision, he said, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of fact. Ava did not lower her eyes. Yes, sir, she replied. Another beat of silence passed, quieter than all the others before it. Then Richard nodded once, small, almost unnoticeable, but real. Good, he said. And just like that, the room shifted again. The word lingered longer than it should have. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single syllable placed carefully into a room that had not expected it. Good. It did not sound like approval. It sounded like correction. The kind that shifts direction without raising its voice. No one spoke immediately after. Even the quiet tapping of keyboard slowed, then stopped, as if the room itself was waiting to understand what that one word meant coming from a man who rarely offered anything without purpose. Richard Whitmore turned slightly, his attention moving away from Ava for the first time since he stepped closer, not dismissing her, but expanding the moment beyond just the two of them. "We are not signing this," he said, his voice calm, clear, leaving no room for interpretation. The decision did not rise. It settled. Across the table, shoulders straightened, screens dimmed, pens stilled. The shift was immediate but controlled, like a machine recalibrating after detecting an error deep within its system. One of the attorneys nodded slowly, already gathering notes, his earlier confidence replaced with quiet urgency. Another executive leaned forward, reviewing numbers again, but this time with caution rather than assumption. The room was no longer moving toward a conclusion. It was pulling back from one. Ava remained where she stood, but something inside her eased, not visibly, not enough for anyone to name it, just a slight release of tension in her shoulders, a breath that moved more freely than the one before. She did not step forward. She did not claim anything. She simply stayed. Richard glanced at the contract once more, then closed it with a measured motion, the soft sound of paper folding onto itself marking the end of something that had almost happened. He rested his hand on top of it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but as if acknowledging how close it had come to being finalized. Then he looked back at Ava. The room followed. His gaze without meaning to. Attention had shifted, fully now, not because of authority, but because of what had just been proven. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight now. It was no longer about identifying her. It was about recognizing her. Ava answered without pause. "Ava Carter." Her voice remained steady, the same tone she had used from the beginning, unchanged by the shift around her. Richard nodded once, committing it, not to memory alone, but to relevance. "Miss Carter," he said, the formality precise, deliberate. "You said this was meant to be missed." Ava gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment, not searching for doubt, but for understanding, as if recalibrating not just the situation, but his perception of her place within it. "Then someone expected us not to look closely enough," he said. It was not a question. Ava's eyes flicked briefly toward the contract, then back to him. "Or expected the wrong people to read it," she replied. That landed differently. It did not challenge him. It reflected something back. A quiet mirror placed between status and awareness. A few heads in the room turned slightly, the implication settling in layers. Not everyone had missed it. Just the ones who were supposed to see it first. Richard's expression did not change much, but something behind it did. A recognition, not of failure, but of assumption. He stepped back then, creating space, not distance, and turned toward the table again. "We review everything from the beginning," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a new edge of precision. "Every clause, every condition, no exceptions." The instruction moved through the room like a reset command. Screens lit again. Documents reopened. But the rhythm was different now. Slower. Careful. Intentional. Ava watched for a moment, then lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in quiet completion of what she had come to do. She had not raised her voice. She had not forced the moment. She had simply refused to let it pass unnoticed. And now, in a room built on power and certainty, something far quieter had taken its place. Attention. The room did not return to what it had been. It moved forward, but carefully now, like every step required confirmation before it could land. Papers shifted, screens refreshed, voices lowered into focused. Exchanges that stayed close to the table instead of filling the space. Ava remained near the edge of it all, not stepping into the center, not stepping away either, positioned in that quiet place where presence did not need to be announced to be felt. The glass wall behind her reflected the city in muted tones, late afternoon lights stretching long across the floor, turning sharp edges into softer lines. For a moment, she allowed her eyes to drop to the reflection of her own hands, still, steady, no longer gripping anything. A few hours ago, those same hands had been moving in small circles across polished surfaces, wiping away fingerprints left by people who would never notice who cleaned them. Now they had placed something in front of those same people that could not be wiped away. Across the table, one of the junior attorneys spoke in a hushed tone, pointing at another section of the document, his voice careful, measured, as if each word had to pass through a filter before being released. There are additional cross-references tied to that clause, he said, glancing toward Richard, then back down again. If this one stands, the others follow. Another attorney nodded, already scrolling, his brow tightening as more connections revealed themselves, each one reinforcing the same quiet conclusion. This was not an oversight. It was design. Richard listened without interrupting, his posture composed, but his attention sharper than before, tracking each detail as it surfaced. He did not rush them. He did not push. The urgency in the room no longer came from him. It came from the realization that they had almost missed something that could not be undone. Ava lifted her gaze slightly, watching the shift unfold not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet distance, as if the outcome mattered less than the fact that it had been seen in time. One of the executives, a man who had barely looked at her earlier, now glanced in her direction more than once, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between curiosity and reconsideration. He did not speak to her, but the way his eyes paused said enough. Something had changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be felt. Richard finally moved again, stepping back toward his chair, but not sitting immediately. His hand rested lightly on the back of it, his gaze sweeping once across the table, taking in the recalibrated energy, the quieter focus, the absence of assumption. Then he looked at Ava again, not calling attention to it, not making it a moment for the room, just a brief, direct acknowledgement that existed between them. Stay, he said, the word simple, unforced, but entirely different from the command that had been given earlier. It did not push her out. It invited her to remain. Ava did not react immediately. The word settled, the same way his earlier one had, but this time it carried a different weight. Not authority, not correction, recognition. She gave a small nod, barely more than a shift in movement, but enough. She did not step forward. She did not take a seat. She stayed exactly where she was, but now, the space she occupied had changed. It was no longer the edge. It was part of the room. And in that quiet, measured shift, something deeper settled into place, not announced, not celebrated, just understood. She had not forced her way in. She had simply refused to remain unseen. The rhythm of the room settled into something quieter, more deliberate, like a machine that had been forced to slow down and now refused to speed back up without understanding every moving part. Pages turned more carefully. Voices stayed low, measured, almost cautious, as if each sentence carried more weight than before. Ava stood where she had been asked to remain, but the air around her felt different now, no longer brushing past her, no longer ignoring her presence. It held, acknowledged, adjusted. She watched the table from a slight angle, her eyes following the movement of hands tracing lines of text, of fingers pausing, of brows tightening as more detail surfaced. The clause had not been alone. It had been the door. Now everything behind it was beginning to show. There is a secondary trigger here, one of the attorneys said quietly, leaning closer to his screen, his voice no longer confident, but precise. If the first condition activates, it cascades into this section as well. Another voice followed, softer, almost reluctant. And that ties into arbitration. We would not just assume liability. We would lose control over how it is handled. The words did not rise. They settled, one after another, forming something heavier than the sum of their parts. Richard Whitmore listened without interrupting, his focus sharp, but not rigid. He no longer looked like a man waiting to approve something. He looked like a man re-examining something that should have been obvious and was not. His fingers tapped once lightly against the table, not impatient, but thoughtful, marking the shift in his thinking more than the passage of time. Ava noticed the small details, the ones most people would miss. The way his shoulders were no longer squared toward the deal, but angled toward the discussion. The way his eyes moved not just to confirm, but to understand. The way silence now carried weight instead of dismissal. She did not speak. She did not need to. The room had begun asking the questions she had already answered. A senior executive leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his gaze drifting for a moment before returning to the contract. "We almost signed this," he said under his breath, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough to be heard. No one responded. They did not need to. The truth of it was already present, resting on the table like something too obvious to ignore now that it had been seen. Ava shifted her weight slightly, the smallest movement, just enough to ease the pressure in her feet after standing so long. The floor beneath her felt solid, steady, but different from before, like the space had changed its rules without announcing it. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention again, not because she was looking for it, but because it was there, clearer now, less blurred by motion. For a brief moment, she saw not the uniform, not the badge, not the role she had been placed into, but simply herself, standing where she was not expected to stand, being heard where she was not expected to speak. Richard's voice broke the quiet again, not sharp, not commanding, but focused. "Who reviewed this last?" he asked. The question moved through the room quickly, passing from one person to another until it settled on a name spoken with less certainty than it should have carried. There was a pause, a glance exchanged, a hesitation that had not existed earlier. Richard nodded once, absorbing it, not reacting outwardly, but storing it somewhere deeper. Then his gaze returned to Ava again, briefly, deliberately, not long enough to turn the room, but long enough to acknowledge that the shift had started with her. "Walk me through it," he said. This time, the request was direct. It did not question her place. It assumed it. Ava did not move immediately. She took a breath, steady, quiet, then stepped forward, just one step, enough to close the distance between the edge and the table. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor was soft, but in that moment, it carried. Not because it was loud, but because it meant something had changed. She reached toward the contract, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed her finger just above the line she had seen first. The room leaned in, not physically, but in attention. And for the first time since she had spoken, she was not interrupting. She was leading. Her finger rested just above the line, not touching it at first, as if even contact required intention. The room did not rush her. No one interrupted. The quiet that followed was different from before, not empty, but expectant, like a held breath waiting to be released at the right moment. Ava lowered her finger slowly, tracing just beneath the sentence, guiding attention rather than demanding it. "This clause looks standard," she said, her voice calm, steady, carrying clearly without force. "But the condition here changes what it means." She paused, not for effect, but to let the words settle. Several heads tilted slightly, eyes narrowing as they followed the movement of her hand across the page. "It says liability transfers if compliance fails," she continued, "but it does not define failure in a fixed way. It leaves it open." One of the attorneys leaned closer, his lips pressing together as he reread the line with that in mind, his finger mirroring hers unconsciously. Ava shifted her hand slightly downward, pointing to the next section, the connection subtle but precise. "And here," she said, "it allows retroactive interpretation." A faint sound came from somewhere at the table, not quite a reaction, more like the quiet recognition of something that had just become clearer. Richard stood beside her now, not towering over, not stepping ahead, simply present, his gaze following the exact path she traced, his attention aligned with hers rather than above it. Ava continued, her tone unchanged, grounded, as if she were explaining something that should have been obvious all along. "That means even if everything appears compliant at the time of signing, it can be redefined later," she said. "And when that happens, responsibility shifts entirely." The words did not need emphasis. The structure itself carried the weight. A junior attorney inhaled sharply, then caught himself, his hand moving to scroll through a related section on his tablet, his expression tightening as the connection expanded. "It is not just exposure," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It is control." Ava nodded slightly, not affirming him directly, but acknowledging the direction he had reached. She moved her finger again, this time to a smaller subsection, one that sat beneath layers of language that made it easy to overlook. "This part anchors it," she said. "It ties the definition back to their internal review standards, not ours." That changed everything. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely. A heavier silence settled, the kind that did not come from confusion, but from clarity. Richard's gaze remained on the page, but something in his posture shifted again, a subtle tightening, not of tension, but of focus. He was not just listening now. He was recalculating. Ava lifted her hand from the paper, letting it rest at her side again, her role in the explanation complete for the moment. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She remained exactly where she was, allowing the room to absorb what had just been laid out without filling the space further. One of the senior executives leaned forward slowly, his fingers interlacing as he stared at the contract, no longer as a document to approve, but as something that had nearly rewritten everything beneath it. "They built this to look clean," he said quietly. No one disagreed. They did not need to. The truth of it was already present, structured, precise, undeniable. Richard finally looked up from the page, his eyes moving across the table, taking in the faces that had been ready to proceed, now forced to reconsider. Then his gaze returned to Ava, not with surprise, not even with curiosity anymore, but with something steadier. Recognition, fully formed now, no longer tentative. "You saw all of that," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Ava met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her voice just as steady as before. "I read it carefully," she replied. And in that moment, the difference between seeing and looking became clear to everyone in the room. No one spoke immediately after that. The explanation did not leave space for argument, only for acceptance, and acceptance came slowly, settling into the room like a weight that could not be shifted once placed. A few of the executives exchanged brief glances, not to challenge what had been said, but to confirm that they had all arrived at the same conclusion. The contract on the table no longer looked like an opportunity. It looked like a carefully constructed risk, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to overlook it. Richard Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the page, but no longer reading it line by line. He had already understood what mattered. His attention had moved beyond the text and into what it represented. "How long would it have taken to trigger?" he asked quietly, his voice measured, directed toward the attorneys, but shaped by what Ava had already revealed. One of them responded after a brief pause, his tone cautious. "It could vary," he said, "but given the flexibility and interpretation, it could be immediate, or delayed until it is most advantageous for them." That word lingered. Advantageous. It did not need to be defined further. The implication was already clear. Richard nodded once, absorbing it, his gaze shifting briefly toward the skyline beyond the glass wall before returning to the table. The light outside had softened, the city taking on a muted glow as the day edged toward evening, reflections stretching longer across the room, blending outlines together in ways that made sharp edges less certain. Inside, however, everything had become clearer. Ava stood quietly, her role no longer active in the explanation, but still central to the moment. She did not look at the others. She did not look for acknowledgement. She simply remained, her presence steady, grounded, unchanged by the shift that had happened around her. One of the senior executives leaned forward, his voice lower now, more deliberate than before. "We would have signed away not just liability," he said, "but leverage." Another nodded slowly, adding, "And once that is gone, there is no way to recover it without conceding more." The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The understanding moved through them in quiet agreement, each person adjusting internally rather than outwardly. Richard finally straightened, stepping back from the table with controlled precision, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the chair before he let it fall to his side. He did not look frustrated. He looked resolved. There was a difference. His gaze moved across the room once more, not searching, not questioning, simply taking in the recalibrated focus of everyone present. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "We halt all discussions with them," he said. The instruction was clear, immediate, leaving no room for delay. A few heads nodded. Devices shifted as messages were prepared, notifications drafted, actions set into motion. The decision traveled quickly, not because it was loud, but because it was final. Ava watched the shift, the movement of people adjusting direction in response to something she had uncovered, something she had chosen not to ignore. She did not step forward to claim it. She did not step back to disappear. She remained exactly where she was, her place no longer defined by where she had entered, but by what she had changed. Richard's attention returned to her once more, not briefly this time, but fully, his gaze steady, direct, without the earlier distance that had separated them. There was no dismissal left in it. No assumption. Only recognition of something that had proven itself without needing permission. "You saw what everyone else missed," he said, his voice quieter now, not for the room, but for her. Ava met his gaze, her expression calm, her tone unchanged. "It was there," she replied. "It just needed to be read." And in that moment, the difference between presence and perception settled into the space between them, clear and undeniable. The room did not rush after the decision was made. It shifted with purpose, but without noise, like something heavy had been lifted and everyone was still adjusting to the absence of its weight. Messages were sent, calls quietly prepared, screens reflecting new priorities as the direction changed in real time. But beneath all of it, something else remained, something that did not move as quickly as the logistics around it. Richard Whitmore stood still for a moment longer, his attention no longer on the contract, no longer on the executives, but on the space between what had almost happened and what had been prevented. It was not visible, not something anyone could point to, but it was there, held in the silence that followed clarity. His hand rested lightly on the back of the chair again, fingers still, as if grounding himself in something that had shifted internally as much as externally. He had built his position on precision, on seeing what others missed, on staying ahead of risks before they formed. And yet, this had been placed directly in front of him, structured to pass through his own system without resistance. That realization did not show on his face, but it settled behind his eyes, quiet, undeniable. Ava remained where she stood, not watching him directly, but aware of the shift in the room, the way attention had recalibrated, the way her presence was no longer questioned. The late afternoon light had softened further now, casting a warmer tone across the glass surfaces, turning reflections into something less sharp, more human. The city outside moved as it always did, unaware of what had just changed inside these walls. One of the executives approached Richard slightly, speaking in a low voice about next steps, about legal responses, about how to reposition the negotiation without exposing what had nearly gone unnoticed. Richard listened, but only partially. His attention drifted back, not to the table, but to Ava. Not in a way that demanded the room follow, but in a way that acknowledged something unresolved, something that had not yet been addressed. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice steady, but quieter than before, carrying less authority and more intention. The room did not stop, but it slowed again, attention shifting subtly without breaking the flow of movement. Ava turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the same calm she had held from the beginning. "Yes, sir," she replied. Richard took a step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make the moment direct. "You were not assigned to this meeting," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Ava nodded once. "No, sir." A brief pause followed, not tense, but measured. "And you chose to speak anyway." Again, not a question. Ava's expression did not change. "Yes, sir." Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming something beyond her words, something in the way she had stood, the way she had not raised her voice, the way she had not stepped back even when told to leave. Then he nodded, small, deliberate. "That was not your role," he said. The room seemed to lean slightly into that sentence, not physically, but in awareness, as if waiting to see where it would land. Ava did not look away. "No, sir," she said again. Another pause. Then Richard continued, his voice unchanged in tone, but different in meaning. But it was the right decision. The words settled into the space between them, quiet, steady, without emphasis, but carrying more weight than anything he had said earlier. Ava did not respond immediately. She simply stood there, absorbing it, not as praise, not as validation, but as acknowledgement of something that had already been true before he said it. Around them, the room continued to move, tasks unfolding, conversations resuming, but the moment between them remained separate, untouched by the urgency that had returned to everything else. Richard stepped back then, not dismissing her, but allowing the space to open again, returning to the flow of decisions that now carried a different foundation. Ava remained where she was for a second longer, then lowered her gaze slightly, not out of habit, but out of quiet completion. She had not changed the room with force. She had changed it by refusing to ignore what mattered. And now, even as everything moved forward again, that truth stayed exactly where she had placed it. The movement in the room continued, but something beneath it slowed again, quieter this time, almost reflective, as if the space itself had not fully caught up with what had just shifted. Conversations resumed in low tones, decisions were made with more care, but there was a subtle hesitation now, a pause before certainty, a second look where there had once been only assumption. Ava stood where she was, her presence no longer questioned, but not yet defined either, existing in that in-between space where change had happened but had not fully settled. She glanced down briefly, adjusting the edge of her badge out of habit, the plastic catching a small reflection of the warm light now filling the room. It was the same badge she had worn all day, the same uniform, the same role, and yet none of it felt quite the same anymore. Across the table, one of the attorneys closed his laptop slowly, his movements more deliberate than before, as if even finishing a task required acknowledgement of what had just been uncovered. Another executive stood, straightening his jacket, but instead of leaving immediately, he paused, his gaze drifting once more toward the contract, then briefly toward Ava, as if recalibrating where she belonged in his understanding of the room. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the head of the table, his attention moving between conversations, instructions, and the quiet spaces in between where thought had room to form. He had returned to control, but it was no longer the same kind. It was more precise now, less assumed, shaped by something that had interrupted it in a way he could not ignore. He glanced toward Ava again, not out of curiosity, not out of necessity, but because her presence had become part of the equation, something that could not simply be removed from consideration. "Who brought you in today?" he asked, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach her without pulling the entire room back into focus. Ava lifted her gaze slightly, answering without hesitation. "My mother works on the evening cleaning shift," she said. "I was helping cover an extra floor." The answer was simple, factual, without explanation beyond what was necessary. Richard absorbed it, the context settling into place alongside everything else he had learned in the last hour. A few of the nearby executives paused just enough to hear it, their expressions shifting subtly, not in judgment, but in recognition of the distance between expectation and reality. Richard nodded once, thoughtful, his eyes briefly lowering before returning to her. And before that, he asked, not pressing, but opening a space for more if there was more to give. Ava hesitated for the first time, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice, as if deciding how much of herself belonged in this room beyond what had already been proven. The pause was brief, but real. "I studied finance," she said finally. "Risk analysis." The words did not rise. They settled, quiet, precise, carrying their own weight without needing reinforcement. One of the attorneys nearby shifted slightly, glancing at her with a new kind of attention, the kind that reevaluates past assumptions in light of new information. Richard's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it aligned, pieces connecting in a way that made the moment make more sense. Not because it explained her action, but because it revealed that it had never been random. "And you are not working in that field now," he said, again not as a question, but as an observation. Ava shook her head once. "No, sir." There was no bitterness in her tone, no explanation offered, just the simple truth of where she stood. Richard let that settle for a moment, the quiet between them filled not with judgment, but with understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. Around them, the room continued to move, but more slowly now, more thoughtfully, as if everyone had become aware that what they saw at first glance was not always what was there. Ava did not step forward. She did not step back. She remained exactly where she was, not trying to belong, not trying to leave, simply standing in the space she had already changed. And in that stillness, something deeper took shape, not announced, not declared, but understood by those who were willing to see it. She had not been out of place. She had been overlooked. The room no longer felt like a place where things simply happened. It felt like a place where things were being reconsidered, quietly, carefully, as if every assumption had been placed under a different kind of light. Conversations continued, but there was a noticeable pause before each conclusion, a moment where people checked themselves, not just their work. Ava remained still, her presence no longer something the room adjusted around, but something it had begun to include without needing to acknowledge it directly. The light from outside had shifted again, warmer now, stretching across the glass table in long, soft lines that blurred the sharp edges of documents and screens. It made everything look less rigid, less certain, as if even the room itself had softened slightly. Richard Whitmore stood at the head of the table, but he was no longer positioned above the moment. He was within it. His attention moved with intention, not speed, pausing where it needed to, listening more than directing. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. He looked toward Ava again, not as an interruption, not as a question waiting to be answered, but as part of the reality he was now working within. "You said you studied risk analysis," he said, his tone even, thoughtful, not testing her, but continuing the line of understanding he had started. Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard considered that for a moment, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to her, as if placing that information alongside everything else she had already shown. "Then you know what happens when something like this goes unnoticed," he said. Ava's expression remained steady, but there was a slight shift in her eyes, not hesitation, but recognition of the weight behind the question. "It does not stay unnoticed," she replied. "It shows up later, when it costs more." The words were simple, but they carried a clarity that did not need expansion. A few of the executives nearby went still again, the truth of that statement settling into the space just as firmly as everything else she had said. Richard gave a small nod, not because he needed confirmation, but because he recognized it. Not just in theory, but in practice, in experience, in the near mistake that had just been avoided. He took a slow breath, then shifted his stance slightly, no longer facing just the table, but the room as a whole. "We build systems to catch risk," he said, his voice calm, steady, but carrying further now. "But systems only work if the people inside them are paying attention." The statement was not directed at anyone in particular, but it reached everyone. There was no accusation in it, just truth. And in that truth, something unspoken moved through the room, a quiet understanding that what had been missed was not just technical. It was human. Ava listened without reacting, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same calm she had held from the beginning. She did not step into the moment. She did not step away from it. She simply allowed it to pass through the space she occupied, the same way everything else had. Richard's gaze returned to her one last time, not searching, not questioning, but settled now, as if something had reached its final position. "You paid attention," he said, quieter this time, not for the room, but for her. Ava met his gaze, her voice just as steady as before. "I did what I was trained to do," she replied. There was no pride in it, no performance, just fact. And somehow, that made it carry more weight. Richard held her gaze for a brief moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as acknowledgement alone, but as acceptance of something that had already proven itself without needing his approval. Around them, the room continued to move, but differently now, more aware, more deliberate, shaped by something that could not be undone simply by moving forward. Ava remained where she was, not elevated, not diminished, just present. And in that presence, something quiet and undeniable settled into place, not announced, not celebrated, but understood by those who had chosen, finally, to look closely enough to see it. The room had settled into a new rhythm, one that no longer relied on speed or assumption, but on something quieter, more deliberate, as if every decision now carried the memory of what had almost been missed. The documents were no longer just reviewed, they were examined, each line given space to reveal what it truly meant rather than what it appeared to say. Ava stood slightly closer to the table now than she had before, not because she had moved much, but because the distance between her and the moment had closed. No one asked her to step back. No one suggested she leave. The space had adjusted around her in a way that did not need to be spoken. One of the senior attorneys looked up from his screen, his expression more composed now, but still marked by the shift that had taken place. "We will need to rebuild the entire framework of this agreement," he said, his voice steady, directed toward Richard but carrying across the room. "There is too much embedded risk to salvage it as it stands." Richard nodded once, not surprised, not resistant, simply accepting the conclusion as part of the correction that needed to be made. "Then we rebuild it," he replied, his tone calm, decisive, but no longer rushed. The words did not carry urgency. They carried intention. Around the table, heads nodded, notes were adjusted, timelines reconsidered, but the movement remained measured, as if everyone understood now that moving carefully was not a delay, but a necessity. Ava listened without inserting herself, her role already fulfilled, yet still present in every adjustment being made. She glanced briefly at the contract again, now closed, resting on the table like something that had already lost its power the moment it had been understood. The reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across its surface, softer now, less imposing, as if even the object itself had been reduced by the clarity brought to it. Richard stepped back slightly, creating space between himself and the table, his attention shifting once more, not to the work this time, but to the person who had changed its direction. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice quieter again, drawing her attention without pulling the room away from its movement. Ava turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, her posture still steady, unchanged by everything that had followed. "Yes, sir." There was a brief pause, not uncertain, but intentional, as if he was choosing his words more carefully than before. "What you did today," he said, "was not small." The statement did not rise. It did not seek acknowledgement. It simply existed, clear and direct. Ava held his gaze, her expression calm, absorbing the words without reacting to them, as if she had not done it for recognition, and therefore did not need it now. "I just read what was there," she replied. Her tone remained even, grounded, without embellishment. Richard watched her for a moment, the simplicity of her answer settling in contrast to everything that had unfolded. Then he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that did not require anything further. Around them, the room continued to move, but the energy within it had changed in a way that would not easily return to what it had been. People were no longer just working. They were thinking. And that difference, though subtle, carried weight. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, not out of habit, but as a natural conclusion to the moment, her role complete not because she had been dismissed, but because the truth she had brought forward no longer needed her to hold it. It had been seen. And once something is truly seen, it does not disappear. It remains, shaping everything that comes after, quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself again. The room no longer needed direction to keep moving. It had found its own pace, steady and intentional, as if something deeper had taken hold beneath the surface of every action. Documents were being rebuilt, conversations refined, decisions approached with a level of care that had not been there before. The glass table reflected not just the light now, but the shift in posture, in attention, in awareness. Ava stood quietly at the edge of it all, her presence no longer questioned, yet still untouched by the movement that surrounded her. She did not reach for anything. She did not insert herself again. She simply remained, the same way she had from the beginning, grounded, still, certain. Richard Whitmore stepped away from the table slowly, not in retreat, but in transition, his role shifting from reaction back into leadership, though not the same kind he had carried into the room earlier. There was less certainty and assumption now, but more strength and clarity. He paused near the window, the city stretching out beyond the glass in long lines of light and shadow, movement continuing without knowledge of what had just been prevented inside these walls. For a moment, he said nothing. The room continued behind him, quiet voices, measured steps, controlled urgency. But his attention was elsewhere, not outside, but inward, settling into something that had changed without announcement. He turned back after a few seconds, his gaze moving across the room, not scanning, not evaluating, simply seeing. And then it returned to Ava, not because she stood out, but because she had changed what the room saw. He walked toward her again, slower this time, not with authority, not with urgency, just with intention. The distance between them closed without pressure, without weight, until he stood just a few feet away. No one stopped what they were doing, but the awareness of the moment shifted again, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like a current moving beneath still water. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm, lower now, not carrying across the room, but staying between them. Ava lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. "Yes, sir." There was no hesitation in her response, no adjustment in tone, just the same grounded presence she had held from the start. Richard held her gaze for a brief moment, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging. "You said you were not working in your field," he said. Ava gave a small nod. "No, sir." A pause followed, but it was not empty. It held consideration, thought, something being weighed not in numbers or contracts, but in something less tangible. Richard glanced briefly toward the table, where the work continued, then back to her. "That is not because you are not capable," he said. The statement was simple, but it carried something that did not need explanation. Ava did not respond immediately. She did not agree. She did not deny it. She simply listened, the words settling without resistance, without reaction. For a moment, the room around them seemed quieter, not because the movement had stopped, but because this moment existed separately from it. Richard's expression remained composed, but something in it had softened, not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the tone of what came next. "You saw something an entire team missed," he continued. "That is not a coincidence." Ava's eyes lowered slightly, not out of discomfort, but out of quiet reflection, as if the weight of the moment did not belong to her alone. "I was just paying attention," she said softly. Richard gave a slight nod, acknowledging the simplicity of her answer, but not reducing its meaning. "That is exactly what this room needed," he said. The words did not rise. They settled, steady, certain, without demand for recognition. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, not stepping into the moment, not stepping away from it. Around them, the room continued its quiet work, but something deeper had already been decided, not in contracts or agreements, but in the way one person had chosen to see what others did not. And in that choice, something had shifted that could not be undone. The room had almost returned to motion, but not to what it had been. It moved differently now, with intention instead of assumption, with awareness instead of speed. Conversations were quieter, decisions slower, but stronger, like each one had been filtered through something that had not existed before. Ava stood where she had been, still near the edge, but no longer outside of it. The space had accepted her without announcement, without ceremony, simply because it could no longer pretend she did not belong. The light had softened even more now, the last stretch of daylight fading across the glass walls, turning reflections into something warmer, less sharp, more human. Richard Whitmore remained in front of her for a moment longer, not speaking, not moving, just present in a way that did not rely on authority to be felt. Then, slowly, he nodded once, a quiet conclusion to something that did not need to be extended further. "We will continue this tomorrow," he said, his voice calm, directed to the room now, but carrying a different tone than when the meeting had begun. It was no longer about pushing forward. It was about doing it right. Around the table, people began to close devices, gather documents, stand with a kind of quiet order that did not rush to leave, but did not linger unnecessarily either. The meeting was ending, but not abruptly. It dissolved, like something that had served its purpose and understood it. Ava glanced down briefly, adjusting her sleeve out of habit, her body preparing to return to where it had started, to the hallway, to the quiet work that no one noticed. She took a small step back, just one, not out of retreat, but out of instinct, the same instinct that had taught her where she was expected to be. Richard noticed. He did not call attention to it. He did not stop her immediately. He simply watched for a second, as if recognizing the movement for what it was. Then he spoke, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to reach her. "Miss Carter." Ava paused, turning slightly back toward him. "Yes, sir." There was no hesitation in her voice, no change in her tone. Richard looked at her for a moment, not as a businessman evaluating a decision, but as a person recognizing another person clearly, without the filter that had existed before. "Do not go back to being invisible," he said. The words were simple, but they did not land lightly. They settled, deep, quiet, carrying more meaning than their structure suggested. Ava did not respond immediately. Her eyes held his for a brief second, then lowered slightly, not in submission, but in reflection, as if something inside her had been acknowledged in a way she was not used to hearing out loud. "I was never invisible," she said softly. "People just did not look." The room had almost emptied now, but that moment remained, untouched by the movement around it. Richard gave a slight nod, not correcting her, not adding to it, just accepting the truth of what she had said. Then he stepped aside, not to dismiss her, but to open the space, to allow her to move forward without being directed. Ava stood still for a second longer, then turned, walking toward the door, her steps quiet against the polished floor, the same sound they had made when she had first entered, but carrying something different now. Not louder, not heavier, just seen. As she reached the doorway, she did not look back. She did not need to. The room behind her had already changed. And, as the door closed softly, the light inside dimming with the end of the day, something remained in that space. Something that would not be undone by the next meeting, or the next deal, or the next assumption. She had not raised her voice. She had not claimed power. She had simply told the truth. And that had been enough.